Trans man kicked out by Karen, then learns she's working for him. How will this story escalate? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. Ethan adjusted his tie as he stepped into the waiting area of the corporate office, feeling the weight of 100 silent judgments pressing down on him. The receptionist, a woman in her early 40s with a tight-lipped expression, barely looked up as he approached. "Excuse me," Ethan said, his voice calm and professional. "I'm here for the 10 a.m. meeting with the hiring manager." The woman, whose nameplate read Karen Matthews, finally looked up from her computer screen. Her eyes narrowed immediately as she took in his appearance. Ethan studied her. "Good. Because if I see otherwise, we'll be having a very different conversation." He let the silence linger for a beat longer, then turned and walked away. Karen didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She knew she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. Ethan walked through the open office space, his badge clipped to his chest as employees glanced up, some with curiosity, others with the wary caution that always accompanied a change in leadership. He was used to it. New management often brought uncertainty. Would he be a tyrant? Would he fire people? Would he disrupt the workflow? He wasn't here to upend things for no reason. He was here to fix what was broken. And Karen was the first crack in the foundation. He stopped by an employee workstation, introducing himself to a woman named Maya, a senior analyst who had been with the company for 6 years. She seemed relieved when he asked about her role instead of launching into some corporate buzzword-heavy speech about change. "We've had a bit of turnover in leadership," she admitted, glancing toward a corner office where blinds were drawn. "If it makes sense?" Ethan nodded, reading between the lines. Leadership had failed them before. He had no intention of making the same mistakes. After chatting with Maya and a few others, he walked toward the HR office, intent on gathering information about company culture, hiring policies, and, most importantly, staff complaints. Because Karen? She wasn't the only problem. An hour later, Ethan sat in a conference room with Denise, the HR manager. She was reviewing company complaints, flipping through incident reports that had been buried. Ethan exhaled as she handed him a thick folder. "These should have been addressed months ago." Denise frowned. "I know. But leadership, well, they weren't exactly proactive." Ethan flipped through the pages, his expression darkening. Employees had raised concerns about discrimination, toxic behavior from management, and yes, Karen's treatment of guests and candidates. "She's been reported before," Ethan noted, tapping her name on the page. Denise sighed. "Multiple times. But she's been here for a while, and the old leadership always sided with her." Ethan leaned back in his chair, contemplating. "That ends now." Denise studied him. "You're really planning to overhaul this place, aren't you?" Ethan met her gaze. "Absolutely. And the first real test of that? Karen's fate." The next morning, Ethan arrived earlier than usual, standing near the front desk as Karen entered. She hadn't seen him yet. Her focus was on her morning routine. She took her seat, adjusting her keyboard, pulling up emails, pretending yesterday hadn't happened. Ethan waited a few seconds, then finally stepped forward. "Karen," he said casually. She flinched. Just slightly. Then she composed herself, looking up with forced politeness. "Mr. Reynolds." Ethan crossed his arms. "Join me in my office?" Karen hesitated. "Of course." She stood stiffly, smoothing out her blouse as if preparing for battle. Ethan led her upstairs to his office, closing the door behind them. He didn't sit. He wanted her to feel the weight of this conversation. Karen shifted on her feet. "Is this about yesterday? Because I really think—" Ethan cut her off. "You tried to keep me out of this company." Karen's expression tightened. "I was just doing my job." "No," Ethan said evenly. "Your job is to be professional, to treat every candidate and employee with respect. Instead, you made assumptions about me. You judged me. And you did it because I don't fit your idea of who should be here." Karen's face reddened. "I didn't mean." "I don't care what you meant," Ethan said firmly. "I care about what you did." Karen clenched her jaw. "So what happens now?" Ethan studied her. "That depends." Karen swallowed. "On..." Ethan leaned forward. on whether you actually understand why this was wrong, and whether you're willing to change. Karen hesitated. Then, for the first time, she looked genuinely nervous. Ethan let the silence linger before speaking again. "You have a choice," he said. "You can learn from this, or you can leave." Karen stared at him, weighing her options. And for once in her career, she wasn't the one holding the power. Karen's breath hitched as she weighed her options. She had never been in this position before, always the one enforcing rules, always the one making the judgment calls. But now, the power had shifted. Ethan watched her carefully. He had no interest in empty apologies or performative regret. If she was going to stay, she needed to prove she understood the weight of what she had done. Karen finally cleared her throat. "But I didn't think I was being unfair." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You didn't think dismissing someone the moment they walked in the door was unfair?" Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "I thought I was looking out for the company." Ethan exhaled slowly, keeping his composure. "By pushing out someone you assumed didn't belong?" Karen hesitated, then looked away. That alone told Ethan what he already knew. She knew she had been wrong. "I'm not going to beg for my job," she finally muttered, crossing her arms. Ethan resisted the urge to laugh. This wasn't about begging. This was about accountability. "Good," he said instead, "because I don't need you to beg. I need you to show me you're capable of change." Karen's eyes flickered with something, defensiveness, maybe, or realization. Ethan continued, "I've reviewed the complaints about your behavior." Karen's head snapped up. "Complaints?" Ethan nodded. "Multiple. And all ignored by previous leadership." Karen's mouth tightened. "This isn't just about me," Ethan said. "You have a pattern of dismissing people who don't fit your standards. Candidates, employees, even guests." Karen inhaled sharply but didn't argue. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "So tell me, Karen, why should I keep you?" Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. She had no quick comeback. No ready excuse. For the first time, she looked uncertain. Ethan waited. Seconds passed. Karen finally sighed. "I didn't think what I was doing was wrong." Ethan nodded, expecting that answer. "And now?" Karen looked down at her hands, visibly struggling. "Well, I see that I was being unfair. Maybe I thought I was helping the company, but I was really just making judgments I shouldn't have." Ethan studied her. "Are you capable of changing that?" Karen swallowed. "But I think I can be." Ethan let her words settle. She wasn't perfect. She wasn't going to change overnight. But the fact that she wasn't fighting back told him something. She knew she had been wrong. And she wanted another chance. Ethan straightened. "Then prove it." Karen looked up. "Where? How?" Ethan folded his arms. "You're going to go through our diversity and inclusion training. You're going to meet with HR regularly. And every month we'll review your performance." Karen nodded stiffly. "And if I fail?" Ethan met her gaze. "Then you won't be here." The silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Karen nodded. "I understand." Ethan exhaled as the door clicked shut behind Karen. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. This was only the beginning. If she truly intended to change, it wouldn't happen overnight. He would have to monitor her progress, ensure she wasn't just saying what he wanted to hear. He had seen it too many times before: performative apologies, empty promises of self-improvement. The real question was, when given the chance, would Karen actually show she had learned from her mistakes? Only time would tell. Ethan glanced at his inbox. His first company-wide email was already drafted. A simple introduction to let employees know that he was stepping in as director of operations. But he wasn't going to stop at just an email. He needed to make his presence known. Later that afternoon, Ethan walked the floor, stopping by different teams to observe their work, introduce himself, and get a feel for the environment. Most employees were friendly, but hesitant. They had seen leadership changes before, and none of them had lasted long enough to make an impact. But Ethan wasn't just another temporary fix. He planned to stay. As he approached the marketing department, he caught sight of a small group huddled near a break area, whispering. At the center of the discussion, "Karen, I can't believe she's still here," a young woman whispered. "I heard she got called into the new guy's office." Another added. Figured she'd be gone after that. Ethan remained out of sight for a moment, listening. I mean, it's not like she's ever faced consequences before, one of them sighed. She's been doing this for years. Ethan frowned. So the problem had been even bigger than he thought. Satisfied that he had heard enough, he stepped forward. The group immediately went silent when they saw him. Ethan smiled. Don't stop on my account. They exchanged nervous glances before one of them, a woman with a name tag that read Sophia, spoke up. Sorry, sir, we were just... She hesitated. Ethan held up a hand. No need to apologize. I want to know what's on your mind. They shifted uncomfortably. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Finally, Sophia took a breath. It's just, we've seen people file complaints against Karen before, and nothing's ever changed. Ethan nodded slowly. That was under previous leadership. The group exchanged skeptical looks. Ethan continued. I won't let that happen again. Sophia studied him, trying to gauge if he was serious. Finally, she said, I hope so. Because people are tired of feeling like their voices don't matter. Ethan nodded. And they do. I promise you that. With that, he excused himself, making his way back toward his office. He had a lot of work to do. And he wasn't going to let this company down. Ethan returned to his office, closing the door behind him and taking a deep breath. He wasn't just here to fill a position, he was here to change a culture that had long been neglected. He could already feel the weight of expectations from the employees who had seen countless leaders come and go without making a difference. He knew that if he didn't act decisively, he'd be just another name on a long list of disappointments. He sat at his desk, pulling up the detailed reports from HR that outlined the patterns of complaints against Karen. It wasn't just isolated incidents, it was a pattern of exclusion, of dismissing people who didn't fit into her outdated worldview. And yet, for years, she had managed to stay in her position because no one had been willing to challenge her authority. Ethan wasn't going to let that continue. As he scanned through the documents, his phone buzzed. It was Denise from HR. We have a bit of a situation, she said the moment he answered. Karen just called me into her office. She wants to discuss her treatment and says she's feeling unfairly targeted. Ethan let out a slow breath. Of course she did. He had given her a choice, to change or leave, and instead of taking accountability, she was already trying to paint herself as a victim. Did she say anything specific? He asked. Denise hesitated. She's claiming that she was just following protocol and that you have a personal vendetta against her. Ethan scoffed. That was the last thing this was about. Tell her I'll speak with her at the end of the day, he said. For now, I want to focus on what actually matters, the employees who've been affected by her behavior. He hung up, rolling his shoulders as he prepared for the next part of his day. He had scheduled meetings with several department heads to get a clearer picture of the company's overall environment. As much as Karen was a problem, she was just one piece of a larger puzzle. If the previous leadership had allowed this kind of toxicity to fester, there were likely other issues that needed addressing. The first meeting was with the head of IT, a middle-aged man named Greg who had been with the company for over a decade. It's refreshing to see someone actually taking initiative, Greg said as they shook hands. Not gonna lie, when I heard we had another new director of operations, I figured you'd be gone in 6 months like the last two. Ethan gave a small smirk. I don't plan on going anywhere. Greg chuckled. Glad to hear it. But if you're serious about making changes, you're going to run into resistance. A lot of people here have gotten comfortable with how things are, even if they're not exactly ethical. Ethan nodded, leaning forward. Tell me what I need to know. Greg hesitated, then let out a sigh. It's not just Karen. She's bad, but she's not the only one. There's a whole network of people who've been looking out for each other, making sure certain voices don't get heard. It's how she's stayed here so long. The previous leadership didn't just ignore the complaints. They actively dismissed them to keep things running smoothly. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his resolve even stronger. Can you give me names? He asked. Greg hesitated, then nodded. I'll send you a list. But be careful, these people don't like change, and they'll do whatever they can to keep their power. Ethan thanked him, his mind already racing with how to approach this new revelation. If Karen was part of a larger system of gatekeeping, simply removing her wouldn't be enough. He needed to dismantle the entire structure that allowed people like her to thrive while pushing others out. As the meeting ended, he checked his watch. There was still plenty of time before his scheduled conversation with Karen, but he wanted to be fully prepared when the moment came. He went back to his office, pulling up the emails Greg had just sent him. It was a list of names, mid-level managers, senior staff members, and even a few executives who had consistently blocked diversity initiatives and ignored harassment complaints. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This was bigger than he thought. But that didn't mean it was impossible. He just had to be smart about how he handled it. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. Denise stepped in, a cautious expression on her face. "I just spoke with Karen again," she said. "She's not taking things well." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What did she say now?" Denise sighed, closing the door behind her. "She's insisting that she's being targeted for doing her job and that she deserves a chance to explain herself directly to the executive team." Ethan folded his arms. She already had a chance to explain herself. What she's really asking for is an opportunity to justify her behavior to the same people who let her get away with it for years. Denise nodded. "That's what I thought too. But she's making noise. If we don't handle this carefully, it could turn into a bigger issue." Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I'll talk to her. But she's not going to like what I have to say." Denise gave him a sympathetic look. "Just be careful. People like her don't go down without a fight." Ethan smirked. "Then she's going to be very disappointed." As Denise left, Ethan sat back, mentally preparing himself for the confrontation ahead. Karen wasn't just fighting to keep her job, she was fighting to maintain a system that benefited her. But what she didn't realize was that the system was already crumbling beneath her feet. And Ethan was more than ready to bring it down completely. Ethan sat in his office, watching the clock tick down to his scheduled meeting with Karen. He knew this conversation wasn't going to be easy. Karen had built her entire career on maintaining control, dictating who did and didn't belong. Now that control was slipping, and she would do anything to hold on to it. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders as he prepared himself. He had faced difficult conversations before, but this one was different. This wasn't just about Karen. It was about changing the entire culture of the company, dismantling the toxic environment that had been allowed to fester for too long. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. The door opened, and Karen stepped inside, her posture rigid, her expression guarded. She closed the door behind her and stood with her arms crossed, waiting for him to speak first. Ethan motioned to the chair in front of his desk. "Have a seat." She hesitated, then slowly lowered herself into the chair. "I don't see the point of this meeting," she said flatly. "You've already made up your mind about me." Ethan leaned forward, folding his hands on his desk. "If I had made up my mind, you wouldn't still be here." Karen scoffed. "Right? So this is just you pretending to be fair before you push me out?" Ethan remained calm. "No. This is me giving you an opportunity to take accountability." Karen's lips pressed together in a tight line. "Accountability," she repeated, voice laced with skepticism. "For what exactly? For doing my job? For enforcing company policies?" Ethan met her gaze evenly. "For creating an environment where people feel unwelcome. For making hiring decisions based on your personal biases rather than qualifications. For dismissing employees before they've had the chance to prove themselves." Karen let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "I was protecting this company." Ethan arched an eyebrow. "From what?" Karen faltered. From instability. From people who wouldn't fit in." Ethan sat back, observing her. "And who gets to decide that, Karen? You?" Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She had no response. Ethan sighed. "I've spoken to multiple employees. I've read the complaints. This isn't just about one incident. It's about years of behavior that have made people feel like they don't belong here." Karen's jaw tightened. "Maybe they don't." Ethan's gaze hardened. "That's exactly the problem." A tense silence filled the office. Karen shifted uncomfortably, but she wasn't backing down yet. "So what now?" she asked. "Are you going to fire me?" Ethan studied her. That depends on you. She scoffed. What does that mean? Ethan leaned forward. It means you have a choice. You can either commit to real change, attend mandatory training, meet regularly with HR, and actively work to create a more inclusive environment, or you can leave. Karen blinked, as if surprised that she was being given an option. And if I refuse? Ethan's expression didn't waver. Then I'll process your termination papers by the end of the day. The weight of his words settled between them. Karen's bravado flickered, just for a second. She looked away, staring at the floor, her fingers tapping against the armrest of the chair. I built my career here, she murmured. I gave everything to this company. Ethan nodded. Then prove you deserve to stay. Karen's throat bobbed as she swallowed. You really think I can change? Ethan exhaled. That's up to you. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Karen nodded slowly. Fine. I'll do the training. Ethan nodded. Then we'll start there. Karen stood, her posture still stiff, but there was something different in her expression. Uncertainty, maybe even reluctance. I'll expect a full report on your progress, Ethan added. And if I see any signs that this is just for show, you're gone. Karen gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the office. Ethan sat back in his chair, exhaling deeply. This wasn't a victory, not yet. But it was a start. He knew Karen wouldn't change overnight, and maybe she never would. But for the first time, she had been forced to confront the reality of her actions. And that was more than she had ever done before. Ethan turned his chair toward the window, looking out at the city skyline. He had taken this job to make a difference, to build something better. And he wasn't going to stop now. There was still a long road ahead, but he was ready for the challenge. Change didn't happen all at once. It happened in moments like these, in difficult conversations, in choices made one at a time. He wasn't just leading a company. He was reshaping its future. And he wasn't going anywhere. Ethan leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath as Karen's footsteps faded down the hall. He knew she hadn't truly accepted responsibility, not yet. Change didn't happen in a single conversation. It would take consistent effort, real actions, and a willingness to unlearn old habits. Whether or not Karen would follow through was yet to be seen. But at least, for now, she knew the consequences. He turned his attention back to the reports on his desk. The deeper he dug into the company's history, the more apparent it became that Karen wasn't an isolated problem. She was part of a larger pattern. The previous leadership had tolerated, even enabled, people like her. Employees who had complained had been ignored or subtly pushed out. Hiring processes had been skewed. Promotions had been given based on favoritism rather than merit. Ethan felt a familiar frustration bubbling inside him. He had expected challenges stepping into this role, but he hadn't expected to be untangling years of systemic bias. He reached for his phone, dialing Denise's extension. She picked up after the first ring. Hey, she said. How'd it go with Karen? Ethan sighed. She agreed to the training and oversight, but I don't think she really understands the depth of the problem yet. I'll be keeping a close eye on her. Denise hummed. That's more than I expected. Honestly, I thought she'd storm out and refuse. Me too, Ethan admitted. But I'm not letting my guard down. If she slips up, she's gone. Denise hesitated. You should know, some of the other department heads are getting nervous. Word is spreading that you're making changes. Not everyone is happy about it. Ethan smirked. But that means I'm doing something right? Denise chuckled. Just don't be surprised if you get pushback. People don't like their comfort disrupted. I don't plan on backing down, Ethan said firmly. I didn't take this job to be a figurehead. That's what I was hoping to hear, Denise said. All right, I'll keep you posted on any developments. Ethan ended the call and leaned back in his chair. He had only been in this position a short time, but he could already feel the resistance building. People who had benefited from the old system weren't going to let go without a fight. But he had come prepared for that. He tapped his fingers against the desk, thinking. If he wanted to root out the problem, he needed to go deeper. He needed to hear directly from the employees who had suffered under the old leadership. He opened his email and started drafting a company-wide invitation, an open-door policy for employees to come forward and share their experiences. As he typed, he could already imagine the responses. Some would be hesitant, others would be relieved, and some, like Karen, would be furious. But that didn't matter. He was here to change things. And he wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the office earlier than usual. He knew today would be important. The open-door policy email had gone out the night before, and he was prepared for whatever responses came his way. He had made it clear that any employee who wanted to speak about their experiences could come directly to him. No bureaucracy, no red tape. The company needed change, and it needed it now. He sipped his coffee as he reviewed the first set of responses. Some were cautious, thanking him for the opportunity but hesitant to speak up. Others were blunt, detailing their experiences of discrimination, favoritism, and systemic exclusion. Each message strengthened his resolve. This wasn't just about Karen. This was about every employee who had been made to feel lesser, every opportunity stolen by a system that favored the same people over and over again. By midday, his office had turned into a revolving door. Employees came in one by one, some nervous, some relieved, some even angry that it had taken this long for someone to care. Ethan listened to all of them. He took notes, asked questions, and reassured them that this wasn't just another corporate initiative that would fizzle out after a few months. One employee, a young woman named Rachel from accounting, hesitated before speaking. "I don't want to get anyone in trouble," she said, fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. "But I've seen things. I've heard things. There are people here who don't even try to hide how they treat certain employees differently." Ethan leaned forward. "You don't have to name names if you're uncomfortable, but I need to understand what's happening so I can fix it." Rachel exhaled, gathering her thoughts. "It's not just about Karen," she finally said. "There are hiring managers who make sure people they don't like never even make it past the first interview. Promotions that get handed out based on friendships rather than performance. And when people complain, it just disappears." Ethan nodded slowly. "That's going to change." Rachel met his eyes. "I really hope so." After she left, Ethan sat in silence for a moment. He had expected to hear about discrimination, about toxic behavior, but the sheer depth of it was staggering. This wasn't a case of one bad employee. This was a rot that had spread through multiple departments, protected by a network of people who had been comfortable in their unchecked power for years. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. Denise stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "It's happening," she said, crossing her arms. "What is?" Ethan asked, already knowing the answer. "Pushback," she replied. "Karen's been making rounds. She's telling people that you're trying to upend the company and punish loyal employees." Ethan let out a slow breath. "Of course she is. She's not the only one," Denise added. "There are others who don't like what you're doing. You're disrupting their comfort, and they don't want that." Ethan considered her words carefully. "I expected this. People don't fight back unless they feel threatened." Denise tilted her head. "And does that worry you?" Ethan smiled. "No. It tells me I'm winning." Denise smirked. "Good. Because you're going to need that confidence?" Ethan nodded. "I'm not stopping now. If they want to fight, they can. But I'm not going anywhere." Denise studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, then let's take this all the way." Ethan exhaled, feeling the weight of responsibility settle even deeper on his shoulders. He had started something that couldn't be undone, and he was ready for whatever came next. The tension in the office had reached a boiling point. Ethan could feel it in the way people spoke in hushed tones, the glances exchanged in the hallways, the way certain employees stiffened when he walked past. Karen and her allies weren't going to let this change happen without a fight, but Ethan wasn't backing down. He had seen too much, heard too many stories to let things continue the way they were. Denise had been right. This wasn't just about Karen. There was an entire structure in place that protected people like her. And that structure was crumbling, one uncomfortable conversation at a time. Ethan had spent the past week in back-to-back meetings with employees who had finally found the courage to speak. Some had spent years watching promotions pass them by, others had been forced to endure microaggressions and outright hostility. One particular conversation stuck with him, an older employee named Marco, who had worked in the company for over 20 years. He had stayed quiet for most of his career, enduring the treatment because he had a family to support, but now, with Ethan in charge, he had finally spoken up. "It's not just the hiring," Marco had told him, his voice low but firm. "It's the culture. People like me, we learn to keep our heads down, to not make waves. Because when we do, we're told we're not a good fit." Ethan had nodded, feeling the weight of Marco's words settle in his chest. "That's exactly what I'm here to change." And now, standing in front of the company's board of directors, Ethan was making his case. Karen had escalated her resistance, gathering support from others who felt their control slipping. She had requested a meeting with the board, claiming that Ethan's leadership was divisive and damaging to company morale. It was a last-ditch effort to stop him, to paint him as the problem instead of facing the reality of her own actions. But Ethan had come prepared. He stood at the head of the long conference table, looking at each board member in turn. "I won't sugarcoat this," he said. "There are people in this company who are fighting change because it threatens them. And if you allow them to dictate the culture, you are complicit." One of the older board members, a man named Sinclair, cleared his throat. "Ethan, these are serious accusations. Do you have proof?" Ethan met his gaze steadily. "I have first-hand accounts from employees across multiple departments. I have hiring records that show clear patterns of discrimination. And I have a long list of complaints that were conveniently ignored by previous leadership." He placed a thick file onto the table. "It's all here." The board members exchanged glances. Karen, seated across from him, scoffed. "This is absurd," she said. "Ethan is blowing things out of proportion. He's making it sound like this company is some kind of toxic wasteland." Ethan turned to her. "You don't get to decide that, Karen. The people who work here do." Sinclair flipped through the documents, frowning. "These complaints, they date back years." "Yes," Ethan confirmed. "And nothing was done. Until now." The board was silent. Karen shifted in her seat, folding her arms tightly across her chest. "So what do you propose?" another board member asked. Ethan exhaled. "A full overhaul of our hiring and promotion processes. Mandatory training for all employees in leadership positions. A zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and exclusion. And most importantly, accountability." He glanced at Karen. "No one should be untouchable." Karen's jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake." Sinclair set the folder down. "No. The mistake was letting this go on for so long." Karen's face paled slightly. The vote was called. One by one, the board members agreed Ethan's plan would move forward. Karen, and anyone else who refused to follow the new standards, would be removed. When the meeting ended, Karen stormed out without another word. Ethan watched her go, then turned back to the board. "This is just the beginning," he said. "There's a lot of work to do." Sinclair nodded. "Then let's get started." As Ethan left the boardroom, Denise was waiting in the hall. "Well," she asked. He gave her a small smile. "We won." She grinned. "Good." Ethan let out a slow breath. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, real change was happening. And he wasn't going to stop now. He walked down the hallway, past the employees who had been watching from a distance, past the ones who had feared speaking up, and past the ones who had been waiting for someone to finally stand up for them. This was what leadership looked like. And he was just getting started.